And I see by the red box we're recording. So welcome everyone to this month's Province 1 Multicultural Awareness and Cultural Competency webcast. And today's topic is welcoming the stranger. Look at how we are assisting new Americans and providing sanctuary, which is a major topic for many parishes in the wake of escalating federal government deportations. So we're really pleased today to have several of our bishops from our province here to speak to this issue. We have Bishop Ian Douglas from Connecticut, Bishop Nicholas Knisely from Rhode Island, and Bishop Tom Ely from Vermont. And we had advertised that we were going to have Chris George with us, who's Director of Integrated Refugee and Immigration Services in Connecticut. And we're not sure whether he's going to make it, but we'll see and have a great conversation as we go along. So first, I'd love to just have an opening prayer. And Reverend Karen Montagno, if you would pray us in, please.
Certainly. God be with you.
And also with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Mother of exiles, shelter of the homeless, we are in need of your mercy. We ask your blessing on your children everywhere who are in danger today. Bless all who suffer from injustice. Shelter them in the warmth of your love, and safeguard them from the evil that rages around them. Turn our eyes and hearts to their needs, and give us courage to act for their good. We ask this relying on your compassion and confident in your love. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Karen. So as Julie had put into the chat, we're asking, we think we're going to have a big crowd for this. As we said, this is a really important and popular topic. So we're going to ask you to keep your video turned off for the moment and your audio muted. We're going to come to a point after the bishops have shared a little bit of what's going on nationally and within their diocese. We're going to invite you then to open up your microphone and also to turn your video on, and then we'll be able to see each other and to share a conversation around this important topic. So this fits perfectly within the work that our Province 1 Task Force has been doing, really trying to raise awareness of issues around the cultures that are here within the province, and how we as the Episcopal Church can follow and be that Jesus movement that our presiding bishop has called us to be. So I want to start off with Bishop Douglas setting a bit of a context for what we're talking about here, and maybe sharing a little bit of what's going on in Connecticut. So Bishop Douglas, over to you.
Thanks, James. I don't want to steal Chris's thunder in case he comes on, so I will say just a little bit about Iris at the end, and then if he doesn't ring in, I'll come back afterwards. I do believe, and clearly the witness and participation of the Episcopal churches and of communities of faith, beginning in the mid-20th century, have been intimately involved, if not the primary vehicle by which refugees have been settled in the United States for the last 50 or 60 years. Of the 9 major organizations that help receive refugees and then help them to find their way to local refugee resettlement agencies, I believe 8 of the 9 are faith-based communities. So it's fundamentally important that we as people of faith, as Christians, as part of this Jesus movement, are participating in and actively engaged in the settlement of refugees here in the United States. And I want to speak specifically to that reality and later we could open it up to wider immigrant and sanctuary movement conversations. But refugees, I believe there's three reasons that we as Christians, we as Episcopalians, should be engaged in this fundamental ministry of helping to settle refugees. And those reasons are theological, political, and also spiritual. The theological reasons are, as Hebrew Bible reminds us, that welcoming the stranger, as we welcome God or angels amongst us, has always been a fundamental tenet of the people of Israel. So welcoming the stranger into our midst is part of our Judeo-Christian tradition and heritage. And also we're reminded of, particularly if you look at Episcopal Migration Ministries graphic image going back to the 1940s when they began, that image of the Holy Family and Jesus himself having been a refugee in Bethlehem because of the slaughter of the Holy Innocents, and that, you know, as a child, our Lord was and knew intimately what it meant to be a refugee. So both our you know, the Hebrew Bible commends it, and the New Testament describes our intimate connection to being open to and welcoming the stranger, the refugee amongst us. And further, and my Episcopal colleagues would remind me that participating in welcoming the refugee into our midst is an act of participation in the wholeness of God's mission in the world. The divisions, the alienation that exists that separates us from one another as countries, as peoples, as races, when we open our arms and welcome the refugee, it is a manifestation of that act of restoring all people to unity with God and each other, and for us as Christians. So there is a profound missiological mandate to participate in receiving and welcoming the stranger, the refugee, into our midst. Secondly, I say there's a political reason why we should be participating in refugee resettlement. In this world of ours, where nations and races and peoples become so quickly alienated from the other, and we're so quick to vilify those who are different from us, racially, ethnically, and religiously, that when we welcome the refugee, when we work to help resettle refugee, we are saying we will not participate in that politics of division. We will not be part of those who seek to sow hate and alienation in this world. And that is a profound political statement right now. And it even goes a little bit further than that. I know here in Connecticut, of the few refugees, sadly, who are coming in, many of them are Afghan families. And to have solidarity with and to walk alongside and to introduce into our community young Afghani families, those who are so quickly identified with the Osama bin Ladens of the world, to welcome young men, young Muslim men and their families, and show here in America that this is the best part of who we are when we are extending our hand in fellowship and in hospitality to these new citizens in the United States. So it is a political act. And then finally, I'd say there are good spiritual reasons for participating in welcoming the stranger, in working with refugees. I've seen, without question, some of the most dynamic parishes be excited, or parishes that become increasingly dynamic and excited and fed and really on fire because of this ministry of participating amongst members that in one's own parish that could settle a refugee family, with other community organizations who want to participate in helping to settle a family, ecumenically and interfaith groups who get together to settle families. So joining together to help receive, welcome, and settle refugee families in our midst gives incredible excitement, hope, and possibility to each and every person and every faith community that stretches themselves to welcome a refugee here in Connecticut. So for those theological / missiological, those political and spiritual reasons, I think this commends our participation in receiving the missionary. Here in Connecticut, we've been receiving refugees going back over 30, actually about 40 years now, through what was originally Episcopal Social Services. In the last decade and a half, that Episcopal Social Service has become its own separate 501c3 status and is incorporated as Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services, known as IRIS. And Chris George is the executive director of IRIS. Because Chris speaks Arabic, we've had many Arabic-speaking refugees settled in Greater Connecticut. Last year, IRIS settled close to 550 people. The majority of them were from Syria and Afghanistan because of this Arabic connection. This year, as we all know, because of the presidential executive order, Syrians are no longer part of the refugee community, and the numbers of refugees coming into the United States are at a historic all-time low. And there's a prediction of there's less than 20,000 refugees will be allowed into the United States of a possible 45,000. So we are lagging behind even what's been allowed to come in this year. The majority of refugees who currently are being settled by IRIS in Connecticut are primarily Afghans and Afghani families, those who have participated and worked with the U.S. military in that long and ongoing war in Afghanistan and have to flee for their lives. And so these young men who speak a little bit of English and their families who speak almost no English, they're all Pashto speakers, are the ones who come and are here with us right now. So I have the incredible respect for Chris George and IRIS, one of the leading refugee resettlement agencies in the nation. And they're struggling. They're struggling under the weight of the presidential executive orders that have really cut into our Christian ministry of welcoming the stranger. So, thank you.
Thank you for that introduction to the context. And I wonder if you, since Chris is not here, we were having a brief conversation before we got started about some definitions and legal versus not. And I wondered if you might just talk a little bit about, from a legal perspective, the definition of a refugee maybe, and others can chime in too, but definition of a refugee and definition of sanctuary, from a legal perspective as well as from a cultural perspective. Just to level set this for some folks who may not be involved in this already.
I will try. It's way over my head, and I am not an immigration lawyer. So take this advisedly. Refugees are those who are state-sponsored through the government and these 9 settlement agencies who are fleeing their country because of the possibility of persecution. They are here with the United States government's acceptance and support, and they receive many of the benefits, such as health care, food assistance, educational assistance, and also sponsorship with United States taxpayer dollars, very small sponsorship, but they are here legally. Sanctuary movements are often individuals and families who are here in the United States and are often undocumented, have not been sponsored through the United States government or the United Nations refugee programs. And so the questions whether it's, DACA and or people who are non-documented who are threatened with expatriation or with leaving the United States. So the very simple thumbnail sketch is that refugees are here legally, sponsored by the United States government through the United Nations and through designated agencies, whereas sanctuary are those who are seeking to stay in the United States and have yet to have documentation.
Great. Thank you for that. So I just want to ask the folks on the call to type in the chat now if you've had experience with refugees and sanctuary movements and this area. Just type it in and let's just see, let everyone see the experience, because I believe we have quite a bit of experience on this topic in the audience. So feel free to type in as we proceed here. And I wanted to, I know we've got a number of people who, when they registered, mentioned some things they wanted to hear and wanted to talk about. And I think Bishop Douglas has talked about a few of those things in terms of the reasoning behind the churches getting involved in this work, from obviously from that missional perspective. I'm just noticing a number of people typed in that they have been doing some of this work already, and some are just starting to do this work, volunteering with Migrants Estes in Vermont, working on La Frontera in Tucson, and I know in Arizona, talking about Arizona, Bishop Knisely is going to talk a little bit about his experiences there, in addition to his experiences in Rhode Island. So a lot of great knowledge in the audience and a lot of great questions, and I'm seeing some good chat going on here as well. And Jane is just mentioning that all refugees are immigrants, but all immigrants are not refugees, so that definitional aspect of things. So I wonder now if I might invite Bishop Knisely to share what's going on in Rhode Island, and just kind of a response to or take off on what Bishop Douglas had just said, and maybe share some of your experience in Arizona as well as working in this area.
Sure, thanks, James. So I feel kind of inadequate to the task. I'm not the person in the diocese who's been doing most of this work, but I did get on the phone in the last couple of days and interview folks in Rhode Island who are. I think one of the key things I want to say about how this is being done in Rhode Island is it's an ecumenical ministry. The Episcopal Church is participating in work that other denominations and other organizations are doing. We're working cooperatively with the Roman Catholic Diocese, the Diocese of Providence. We're working with directly and closely with the Lutheran Synod here. We're working with the American Baptist, the Unitarian Church. We've been working with the Muslim community as well as the Jewish community as we've been sort of working between one another. In Rhode Island, there are two major organizations that work with refugees and immigrants. Dorcas is the largest. It's a pretty significant organization based in Providence, and it's the primary resettler of refugees in the state. The other organization is the Diocese of Providence, the Roman Catholic Diocese. They've been the #2 provider for a number of years. They're in a funny place right now, I'm told, because the way the regulations are written, especially for funding from federal sources, if you don't resettle at least 100 refugees per year, you're no longer eligible to find the kinds of resources you need. Which means that in the Diocese of Providence, they are starting to see staff drift away. That if this sort of desert of funding continues for a while, their ability to welcome and provide support is going to be significantly impeded. We're seeing the same sort of thing happening at Dorcas. though they still have funding at least through this year. And I'm told next year is when the real crunch is going to happen. They're starting to lose people. They've lost 3 or 4 staff members so far this year, not in this case because of the funding, but because the unsettled nature of things. People have families. They're trying to figure out what to do for next year. Some of them are wandering away and looking for other things. And from what I've heard, the largest challenge in the immigrant community as well as the refugee community right now is the behavior of ICE in Rhode Island. People who are here in Rhode Island, I'm told, have known ICE and are expected to check in with ICE a couple of times a year. What's happening right now since the election is that randomly people are coming in for their regular check-in with ICE, and they're being arrested. And it doesn't happen every time. It doesn't happen to everyone. You're never quite sure when that's going to happen. So that's created a reluctance for people to go in, and then that creates a situation where they're not in compliance with the regulations, and because they're not in compliance with the regulations, that gives them another excuse to be deported. That's probably less true with the refugee community that has documentation, though I understand that the concern has spread to them as well. But it's certainly true with the people who are here without formal documentation. I probably want to say, one of the experiences I had in Arizona when I was there is there are often people who are here legally, but they don't have formal status. You can begin the application process even if you're in the country, and you have status, and you have the right not to be deported. We used to, in Arizona, we worked with immigration lawyers. We had little cards that we handed out to the immigrant community, reminding them that they do have certain rights if they were ever detained, and what those rights were, as well as having information about how they could contact an immigration lawyer. And we would speak to groups as we would organize them and remind them how they should cooperate with the authorities and what the authorities had lawful ability to ask and what the authorities might ask that they weren't able lawfully to ask, and help people who were in that kind of gray area where they were in the country but without formal status learn about what that was like. We do have a network of immigration lawyers here in the state. They're mostly working with the Latino community. I'm told the local Unitarian Church, we're a number of Unitarian Church, but the Unitarian Church in Providence, the large one, has decided it's going to be a formal sanctuary site, is already beginning the work of what they can do to support a family that chooses to be in sanctuary. We were talking a little bit about sanctuary at the very beginning, and sanctuary as a legal status it's not clear what legal protections you have in sanctuary status. When I was at the cathedral in Arizona, we made an intentional decision in conversation with the community of immigrants and undocumented people that were in the worshiping community to not become a publicly recognized sanctuary site. We wanted to sort of keep a much lower profile because we had so many people in the place. What we hoped would happen was the prominence of the congregation and the people who worshiped in it would help dissuade raids that might have happened in other places. And in fact, that's what we discovered. We kept a low profile, and we were able to be a place of safety and resource for folks. Places that were sanctuary sites drew attention, and in some ways that was helpful because that was the focus of the conversation, and it allowed people who were going to work on the edges a little bit more freedom to function. Just checking to see here what other notes I have. Because of the funding crunch, we're having trouble hiring people to work with the immigrant community and the refugee community, particularly at Dorcas. We're losing people. The local coordinator has had to shoulder a great deal more work. And this is all happening against sort of unrest and anxiety within the community. There's been a lot of our refugee community here in Rhode Island right now is Congolese. They're working closely with the Muslim community. We have about 600 to 800 folks here in Rhode Island, and there's been some issues about acculturation domestic violence, how that works in this country, and how the community of Congolese will work cooperatively with Dorcas and other organizations. We have a refugee family, 2 refugee families living in the rectory of one of our congregations. That's working pretty well at the moment. One of the things we're funny, the men who came with the families are employed. The women of the families are not. An interesting thing has arisen. There's a 20-year-old girl who came. She's too old to go into the school system, but she doesn't have sufficient education from where she came from to be able to get a job here in the United States. It's a catch-22 situation where they need additional education to be able to get a job and support a family, but they aren't able to do it, and because of the age, they're not able to enter into the regular school system. So they're working through Dorcas on GED work. At the federal level, we work closely with our senators, Reid and Whitehouse. We do what you can. We know the executive branch is going to do what it's going to do. Senator Reid has been incredibly responsive. Senator Whitehouse, not quite as much, but they've both been supportive. The governor, Gina Raimondo, has been very supportive. We have legislation at the State House right now that would work to protect the 800 DACA kids that we have in Rhode Island. Looks like that'll pass, but we're not sure what effect it will have because it's state, and we're not sure what the boundaries of state and federal law would supersede. And we're having a conversation in the state right now about issuing driver's license for people who don't have full regular documentation. Just interestingly enough, the same conversation we had in Arizona, where we want people to be able, who are here and are working, to be able to get to work safely and not endanger the lives of other people on the road. But it creates issues, and with ICE's enforcement actions lately, we're not sure at this point if people would be willing to go into a state building and fill out the necessary paperwork to get a driver's license or not. I think that's the news that I have.
Well, that's a lot, and that's a lot of great insight into to what's going on and Rhode Island in particular. But I think as you were talking about the issues with ICE, for example, and their behavior, I know in New Hampshire we've experienced the exact same behavior, and it's been a concern of many of our parishes, and ecumenically speaking, and we're dealing with the same kinds of issues here in New Hampshire. So that's good to hear. And I was particularly struck listening to your description of the challenges and the funding aspect, the minimum number of settlers that's required to maintain that funding from the state and the resources, and so that it's always, of course, funding is always a challenge.
Well, I think funding, particularly with the implications for staffing, given that people aren't going to be looking for other work that they can use to support their family. I think Chris is here.
Yes, Chris is here, and I mentioned to Chris that we'd give him a couple of minutes to settle in before we asked him to share. Bishop Douglas did a fantastic job of setting the context from the, and I'm going to use the M word, the missional perspective for the church, for the work that we're doing. And so, Chris, just wanted to get your sense, being on the ground, and of what you're seeing both nationwide and what you're seeing in Connecticut, and help us flesh out that context for what we're doing a bit more in the province.
Okay, I'm not sure you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Great, okay. I apologize for coming on late. You know, my first 10 years as the director of a refugee resettlement agency, I begged for attention. I pleaded for press coverage. And since the middle of 2015, it has been almost nonstop. It's just been remarkable. All it took was a missile strike on Syria for all of our local media to be interested in interviewing me about local reaction. So it's been a pretty...
Is my noise level too loud?
Can you hear me?
Well, no, yours doesn't bother me at all.
Okay. Okay, good. So let me give you an overview of refugee resettlement. You probably noticed that the Trump administration has drastically cut the number of arrivals nationwide, even though then President Obama at the end of 2016 said that we would bring 110,000 refugees. In 2017, we only brought around 50,000. This year, the goal was set at 45,000, but it looks like we probably won't even reach 25,000 for the fiscal year for the country. And worse than that, in the long term, are the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle the entire refugee resettlement program. You know, there used to be about 300 refugee resettlement agencies spread across the country. We're now down to about 250. And that number will get even smaller as funding is cut. We are relatively secure in Connecticut because we have a lot of private funding and a lot of public support. But there are a lot of agencies who will be laying off staff and closing down over the next year. The predictions out of Washington are pretty gloomy, almost apocalyptic about the state of refugee resettlement in the coming year. And we're preparing ourselves for the worst. But what we can do, what we do have control over, is the degree of public engagement in the refugee resettlement process. And we've been trying to do that as much as we can in Connecticut by using this very old-fashioned model that we have updated and revitalized. Community-based resettlement of refugees. We used to call it congregational co-sponsorship, but we're now open to working with just any group to resettle refugees. And our goal is to increase the number of Americans who are actually involved in refugee resettlement, even though the total number of refugees coming to this country is declining rapidly. And I turn to all of the congregations and ask for their support. And in Connecticut, we've been very successful, but we want to see this happening in other states. The refugee resettlement agencies, especially the secular ones, have not been very enthusiastic about embracing this model. Refugee resettlement agencies have a hard time letting go of the resettlement process, trusting groups of volunteers. But it has worked very well, and we need to do more of it. Ironically, there are two entities that are very interested in spreading this model all over the world. Neither of them are American refugee resettlement organizations. One is the Canadian government, and the other is the George Soros Foundation. Both are very interested in seeing community-based resettlement really take off and implemented all over the world. There are already 13 or 14 governments that are doing it along the lines of the Canadian. But as I said, this is an old traditional way of welcoming. And it was the model used by churches and synagogues for many years. It was really early 80s, when the U.S. government got involved in refugee resettlement, organized it, funded it, privatized it by working with national voluntary organizations. Then we saw a decline in the degree of community involvement. We need to get back to that. And in the long run, the best way to change public policy in Washington is through a grassroots movement that is stimulated by engagement in refugee resettlement, a grassroots movement that will pressure our elected members of Congress, who will then push back on the administration and will get that refugee resettlement, those refugee arrival numbers back up where they should be. So it's a very strange time for refugee resettlement. I think you'll see things probably get worse before they get better. But the role for churches is to step forward, knock on the doors of their local refugee resettlement agencies and say, we want to help. We want to financially help to keep you guys alive during this period, and we want to bring forward teams of volunteers so that we can participate in resettlement.
So if I could, thank you for that. That's a very interesting kind of big picture perspective of what's been going on, and I'm particularly interested in talking more about the community resettlement model. But I did want to just ask about that last comment you made. And I'm curious to hear how this relates to the situation in other dioceses in the province. You mentioned what we can do as a church and as a church's members is to knock on the door of the resettlement agencies and offer help. I'm curious, how do we find those resettlement agencies? And are there really enough, do they exist in northern Maine, for example, or in southern Vermont? How do we find them? And if they don't exist, what do we do? What can we do?
Mm-hmm. There are websites that list all of the refugee resettlement agencies. You can probably find them through the State Department Bureau of Population, Refugee and Migration, PRM. And then you could also go to Refugee Council USA. That's an umbrella organization. Refugee Council USA. It's an umbrella organization that represents all 9 of the national organizations that are involved in refugee resettlement. And those include Episcopal Migration Ministry, Church World Service, Lutheran Federation, Catholic Charities, on and on. And that's, there are agencies in every state, and they're all feeling that they face an existential threat. Support, even if it is relatively small support, can make the difference between laying off a case manager or keeping that case manager employed.
Okay, great. So when we say support, obviously financial, are there other things that we can do, we can offer? Love to hear some example of those for folks so they can get a better sense of what that means.
Volunteering, either as individuals or groups of individuals to help with all of those services, driving refugees to appointments, teaching them English, tutoring children, helping them find jobs, all of this, setting up apartments. There still is a trickle of refugees coming into the country, and there's still work that needs to be done. not to mention the thousands of refugees who have come over the past few years who still need help. Again, with things like learning English, job upgrades, the kids need help in school. So offering long-term assistance to a refugee agency could, this is not an exaggeration, it could mean the difference between that organization keeping its doors open or having to shut down.
Right. Great. So I see by the clock on the wall we're at 8:10, and that this is very, very enlightening. I wanted to give Bishop Ely a few minutes to just share his perspective and a little bit of what's going on in Vermont. So Bishop Ely.
Thank you. This is an interesting conversation that's been very visible in my world the last few days, actually. When I came to Vermont in 2001 as bishop, shortly after I arrived, the first wave of South Sudanese refugees arrived in Vermont. And we've had a long history of working with Vermont refugee resettlement, with the Sudanese refugees, many of whom are members of our congregations. And sometimes it takes a long time for something positive to happen that you hadn't expected would happen. And just on Saturday night, we had 100 people at the Cathedral Church in Burlington gathered with the Sudanese community and raising funds so that the Sudanese children, about 21 of them who participate in the soccer program that they have, can come to our summer camp this summer. And we're really very excited about that. So staying with these folks and working with them and they working with us has been a real blessing from my perspective. Vermont Refugee Resettlement has, like all the other agencies, been hurt by the numbers and by the reduction in funding. We were in our Rutland community, and I know that Wendy Grace, our coordinator, is on the call. We were all set to welcome a number of Syrian refugees, and only 3 families were able to get through the Trump reductions. They're doing well, but as a result of that, the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Office in Rutland was forced to close. So we're going to see more of that. And one of the things I learned in talking with Wendy was, and I think, Chris, you probably were alluding to this, that part of the challenge is going to be, even if the numbers start to increase, the pipeline that it takes to get somebody from their status into refugee status welcomed into this country is a long process. And there were a lot of people who were in that process who were ready to make the move into the United States, who were then left basically at the door. And to reboot that whole system it will take time, and that will impact the finances, even if we ever get a change in the thinking. So that's just another dynamic that's at work. The other thing I would point to from our experience in Vermont is that a lot of our work has been with migrant justice. We have a lot of migrant workers in Vermont who are not technically refugees because they've not been welcomed through the programs, but they're here in Vermont. Some are seasonal farm workers, some are here working on the dairy farms. The Ben & Jerry's ice cream that you so enjoy is oftentimes comes from a cow that's been milked by one of these migrant workers. And migrant justice has been working very closely with them and with us, and we've been part of their work. And we were just at the first Vermont Summit on Sanctuary on Sunday afternoon. That was partly sponsored by Migrant Justice, Vermont Interfaith Action, and others, where we heard from the Migrant Justice folks about a way in which we can really be impactful here, and that's to work with our local communities around the fair and impartial policing policies in Vermont. Vermont has some good laws, but they're not always enforced, and different communities are working hard. Winooski here in Vermont has one of the best. Each police department has to adopt the fair and impartial policing policies at some level. So that's an area where we can actually work with our local communities in helping to strengthen those fair and impartial policing policies that have to deal with things like traffic stops. In Vermont, you can get a driver's license without social security number and all those other things. But we've had situations where people have gone in to get those, and then somebody in the DMV has squealed on them and ended up getting caught in the ice trap. So the other part that came out of Sunday was our first introduction to this Vermont Summit on Sanctuary, in which we were looking at what's involved in that. And you're looking for a resource here. Vicki Kemper, the pastor at First Congregational Church in Amherst, Mass., was our keynote speaker for this. And she was very powerful, very articulate about the challenges and the difficulties, as well as some of the rewards from being part of their hosting a man in sanctuary, and have been for quite a while. So that's on the docket here in Vermont. The other piece I just want to throw into the conversation, just so we're there, because it's important to the work that I'm doing with an organization in Central America, a human rights organization in Central America, Knisely, is the whole issue of a temporary protective status and how that is impacting thousands and thousands of people who are trying to flee from violence and other realities, especially in Central America. And Knisely is one of the organizations in Central America that's actually trying to do something about this and is being effective. But the problem is huge. And the way that the folks who are trying to leave those places for fear of violence, gang violence, all those things we talked about earlier, are really having a hard time. And those in this country who are covered by temporary protective status are also in fear. So that's a whole nother piece of this, how we welcome all these strangers who are in our midst. And you know, we've been most effective in the refugee because there's a legal status that's there. The other challenges around those who don't have necessary legal status, Nicholas mentioned DACA and others, that's a real challenge for us in terms of the way in which we can relate. So here in Vermont, I think we're trying to work with Vermont Refugee Resettlement, with Migrant Justice, with the folks who are interested in sanctuary. Vermont Interfaith Action has been very much involved in this. Peace and Justice Center in Burlington. And there are folks in Southern Vermont who are working on this as well. So that's a little bit about what's going on in Vermont. Many of our congregations have expressed interest, and some were able to help out with the refugees who are resettling in the Syrians who are settling in Rutland. But again, that dried up. We've had Bosnian refugees in the Burlington area. Burlington is a place where they mostly come. We've also had Bhutanese and other refugees. I think there are 34 languages that are spoken in Burlington High School, probably as many in Winooski right now. So there's a growing refugee and immigrant population in Vermont, and it offers our churches an opportunity to try to reach out. We had a great clergy day with folks involved in Vermont refugee resettlement, and so a number of our congregations are ready to try to help. And the question is, where are those places where they can give their help? So that's a little bit about what's going on in the scene here in Vermont, at least from my perspective, and there are other Vermonters on the call who can add to that.
Well, thank you. That's a great picture, and I was particularly interested to hear the juxtaposition of the migrant justice work along with the refugee settlement work, and how many of the same issues are faced, and it's just people coming from a different location and in the country for a different purpose, I think is really what the difference is there. I'm wondering.
Well, one thing, James. One of the most effective recent efforts on migrant justice has been the Milk with Dignity movement, in which they actually forced Ben and Jerry's to live up to their promise around supporting migrant farm workers and to sign the agreement that they had promised they would. And that was a lot of work and a lot of demonstration, marching all the way from Burlington to Waterbury to their headquarters. But that Milk with Dignity, and you can go online and look at migrant justice and Milk with Dignity, and you'll see the good outcome of that hard work. So those are the kind of ways, and there were a lot of people of faith, the Modern Interfaith Action, and others working with migrant justice to help make that happen. So that's a good example of the partnership that's possible.
I think that's fabulous, and it reminds me of, I grew up in South Carolina, and my parents were part of the economic movement to make change, and the way they did it was using their economic power. And so I think churches have an opportunity to do that very same thing by banding together, using the economic power to convince organizations to do what they should do. So we're at about 8 minutes left, and I wanted to just open it up for those folks who have had some experience doing this work to react to what you've heard, maybe share a story or two. So for those of you who have had experience in doing this work, I invite you now to turn on your video and unmute your mic and maybe share a thought based on what you've heard tonight so far. I know Wendy's on from Vermont. I know we've got a couple other folks on who have mentioned in the registration process that they have some experience. So feel free to come off mute or even type in your thoughts based on what you've heard. Eric is sharing about a news story about research report, Driving While Black and Brown in Vermont. Some news stories there. Anyone like to come off mute and share? Or feel free to type in questions that you'd like to ask of our panelists while we're here. And I really would just highlight some of the examples of where people can get involved that Chris and Bishop Knisely and Bishop Ely lifted up. Everything from money, which is always needed, and I'm seeing across the province and each of the dioceses funding for these resettlement agencies is an issue. But even helping the children of some of these folks with homework, helping them with finding what we take for granted as City Hall and how to navigate that. Many of these folks are coming from places where the governmental structure is nothing like what we have here. So just helping them to navigate that is helpful. Elizabeth is saying, presumed chat will be saved and sent with the link to the video, and we will save that. And I think Wendy is saying she cannot unmute or turn on video. So Julie, I think you have control of that. Can you help Wendy with coming off mute at least, if not? And then for starting your video, Wendy, if you move your cursor to the bottom of your window, you should see a start video option, and also a little microphone where you can unmute yourself. It should be at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And Chris has hands up.
Yeah, one more point. So most of the refugee program has been suspended by the Trump administration. There are small trickles of refugees coming in from different nationalities, but there is one exception. There is one opening, and that is for Afghan refugees who are coming through the Special Immigrant Visa Program. These are families of Afghans who worked with U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Because of their association with the U.S. government, they and their families have received death threats. So the U.S. government is allowing them to come in to the United States, what is basically through the refugee program, in relatively large numbers relative to the shamefully low numbers overall. Afghan families need a lot of help, especially the women. Most of them don't speak a word of English, in direct contrast to their husbands who speak English fairly well. And most of the women are not used to leaving their homes or venturing outside of the home. So there are a lot of opportunities, especially for female Americans, women members of your congregations, to volunteer and help these women, tutoring them in their homes, bringing groups of them together in what we call fondly a mommy and me program. And if your local refugee resettlement agency hasn't thought of it, then you mention it to them. They, I've heard from an agency in Connecticut that these women need help. We're ready to help them. And it'll really be enormously valuable. So check that out as well.
And Chris, your ears might have been burning before you got on, because I was giving lots of kudos to you and to Iris specifically for reaching out to Afghan refugees and their families. So you've just come full circle to where we began. They think we probably planned this, but we didn't. So thank you, Chris.
All right, thank you.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so just to kind of reiterate what Bishop Ely says, in Rutland, we did accept only 3 families in the time that we had the Syrian refugees resettled here. But they are doing really well. And Chris, as you mentioned, one of the really important things is really connecting with the women, the mothers. These families, though, we were pretty fortunate in that they're pretty active, culturally speaking, high-functioning women, except for one. And it took her a long time to be able to assimilate. But the really positive thing, if there's anything positive to come out of it, I mean, there is that all 3 of these families have been able to assimilate really well into the Rutland community and the culture, in spite of not having that. Generally, when refugees are resettled, they want to resettle refugees into a community where they're going to have people from their own culture to help support them in becoming part of the new culture. Not having that, they had no choice but to rely on the community that was there. And fortunately, Rutland has been really very welcoming. Great. After its initial fear factors, like, what are we gonna? How can we support these people? But the one thing that I have learned personally through EMM and through the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program is that one of the greatest things that congregations and parishes can do is really advocate. If you can't get out and volunteer because you're too far away from a resettlement agency, no one is too far away from their legislators and their congressmen to be able to advocate on behalf. And the thing that is important to remember is that you don't do it once and think you've done it. You can't just write or call your congressman once and say, okay, I did my duty, I've advocated on behalf. They need to hear it over and over again. They need to know how determined people really are, how persistent their constituents are in these issues. So that is something that I've been really trying to push in our communities.
Bravo.
Did we lose James?
I fear so.
I don't see James.
Over to you, Karen. Wrap us up and pray us out.
Okay. This is a little lengthy one, but I think it will be helpful to help us change gears and do whatever it is that we need to do later on tonight. Lord be with you.
And also with you.
May our eyes remain open even in the face of tragedy. May we not become disheartened. May we find in the dissolution of our apathy and denial the cup of the broken heart. May we discover the gift of the fire burning in inner chamber of our beings, burning great and bright enough to transform any poison. May we offer the power of our sorrow to the service of something greater than ourselves. May our guilt not rise up to form yet another defensive wall. May this suffering purify and not paralyze us. May we endure. May sorrow bind us and not separate us. May we realize the greatness of our sorrow and not run from its touch or its flame. May clarity be our ally and wisdom be our support. May our wrath be cleansing, cutting through the confusion of denial and greed. May we not be afraid to see or speak our truth. May the bleakness of the wasteland be dispelled. May the soul's journey be revealed and the true hunger fed. May we be forgiven for what we have forgotten and blessed with the remembrance of who we truly are. Amen.
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 Sorry about that, but I did come back. I want to really thank all of the bishops for being here and for Chris for joining us and the comments that folks have typed into the chat. This has been, I think, a very enlightening discussion and a needed discussion. And we'll be posting the video and the chat notes on the Province One website. So please stay tuned for that. Come back and visit. Hopefully we'll have it up in another week or so. And our next webcast will be next month. The topic is implicit bias. So please make sure you put that on your calendar for May. Let's see, what is it, the date? May. Should have that.
Somebody from Starbucks will be here?
May 15th? May 15th?
May 15th, yes, May 15th. So thank you all, and have a good evening.
So long.
Bye. Thank you.